So, hi everyone. I'm JD Tawasik. I think everybody on this call is familiar with what we're doing and who we are, but just very briefly, these salons have been organized in response to the Getty PST initiative and what we did collaboratively with the cultural programs, the Pacific Standard Time initiative at the end of last year. And these are a series of salons that are continuing so that we can continue to have the conversation and build a network around ideals of exhibit evaluation, program evaluation for cross-disciplinary programs, both pre and post evaluation, with an emphasis in thinking about community and community engagement. And for today, we have a very special treat that Sasha Sherman, who's the Associate Professor of Cognitive Science at Occidental College, and Nancy Mithlo, who is excuse me, curator and writer professor, and is chair of American, who has worked as chair of American Indian Studies at the Autry National Center Institute, and is professor of gender studies and American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. They have agreed to share some of their work and use this work as a platform for us discuss this. So Nancy, Sasha, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much for that warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Inja Nitagote. My name's Nancy Mithlo. I'm calling out from Los Angeles, the home of the Tongva and the Gabrielino peoples. And I've been so fortunate to partner with Sasha Sherman on a project. This dates from what, Sasha? We started in 2015 to 2018. I think those were the dates that we received NEA research funding to do basically an inquiry into perspective taking in the museum setting, working with visitors. And throughout the years now, we've produced a couple of articles, done a couple of conference talks. We've got some findings, and we're just really honored to be with you today. Hope we can problem solve in our conversations around where you are with your projects. I think I'm involved in two projects with this Getty PST. One's at the Fowler Museum and one's back at the Autry Museum. So looking forward to the conversation. And Sasha, I'll let you maybe pick it up from here.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Sasha, as was just discussed, and I haven't been a part of these conversations yet, but I'm excited to be here and hear how our work can contribute and generate some productive conversation, particularly around how perspective taking and empathy might be useful and also used with caution in museum settings. So I'll go ahead and take us to the next slide.
Yeah, so you know, my work is as an American Indian Studies scholar, and I really met Sasha and this common quandary of, you know, how do we address these enmeshed and persistent biases for interpreting American Indian lives? And so I guess as a precursor, I'll say this is not what I typically do. I typically look at American Indian communities, and because we're looking at museum community and educating primarily non-natives, this is sort of what I call my public service announcement about biases with non-native audiences. And I've just gained a wealth of knowledge from Sasha about how to do this with the discipline of cognitive science. So, you know, we do think that museums have something to offer, especially in connection with source communities. And the challenge that we are addressing with this one study is how can we get the visitors to question their entrance narrative, right? Their preconceived notions. And in particular, how could we increase cultural competence and empathy for American Indian populations? And I'm using some terminology like restricted visual registers, persistent biases. I think you could easily substitute just racism and stereotypes. I shy away from using stereotypes as a frame because I think it's inherently kind of really tightly woven with negative registers. And so I typically talk about conventional narratives, and that certainly is a large part of what the study addressed. So Sasha, we can go to the next one.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention as well that what we're going to be talking about here is this very highly collaborative work, but it also involves these multiple sets of methods. This particular project wasn't initially in my area of expertise either, and so I think we both brought each other in to bring both of our areas in. And just very briefly, the area that I typically study has to do with what I call multisensory perception. So how we sort of gain this very seamless perceptual understanding of the world. And I test that using, or I try to understand that using very many kinds of methods, some of those being quantitative methods, and you'll see that come in as we describe some of our work today. Go.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, my training is as a cultural anthropologist and as a visual anthropologist, and so I'm definitely kind of a humanist, scholar, qualitative, person, and so we were both really trying on some new things with this study. So this idea of encouraging visitors to be more empathetic of others, we found a lot of studies around empathy in the literature, and most of it kind of seemed to have a predetermined conclusion that if you just do A and B, you're going to get C. And we wanted to test that. Do visitors can they actually change their attitudes within a museum visit? Can they come in with an entrance narrative that's very narrow? And can they widen or even alter that scope of orientation? And a lot of our findings really point to the fact that that is a far reach, and especially with American Indian source material. So one of the things that I like to really remind folks who are learning about this work with us is that for museums to collapse every minoritized community in one methodology of educational outreach is not effective at all. And that for American Indian populations in particular, there are certain tropes, certain conventional narratives that make it really difficult for audiences to respond in ways that I think museum educators assumed that they were going to respond. And that's due to this kind of objecthood of American Indian personhood. And so that's an area that I keep kind of circling back to. So when we did the work at the Autry, we actually installed a museum exhibit. Sasha's going to walk us through some of our methodology. And we wanted to just collect data and actually deal with the literature. But of course, in a museum setting, because we were depending upon the staff and they were so wonderful to work with, the museum education department wanted recommendations. They asked us straight up for recommendations. And so the one point where we landed was this idea of, can we forestall making a conclusion? And can we build tolerance for uncertainty? And so you'll see us circle back to that at the end of this presentation.
And just some quick background on empathy related to how we framed our study. Nancy started to mention that the literature suggests that there is, or a very substantial literature suggests that something called perspective taking. So what that refers to is this idea that this kind of idea that you can, as a person, take on the perspective of somebody else. So not just be able to actually feel their emotions, right? You might look at someone who's smiling and smile. That's one form of empathy. But another form of empathy is what we call perspective taking, which is actually being able to take on somebody's perspective. Think about yourself in their shoes. And those two different forms of empathy, we were trying to sort of look, or at least discriminate between. And there's substantial literature that suggests that this kind of perspective taking, not just the sort of affective empathy, has a host of benefits. So things like increasing compassion, increasing people's pro-social behaviors, increasing their understanding of other people that are outside of who they consider in their current in-group, engaging in more intergroup contact, and also decrease stereotyping. So we were hoping to see, can we actually ask people in the museum to do a kind of perspective taking exercise. And if we can do that, will they have this host of benefits? Will they increase their compassion towards the source community that they're engaging with? And on the other side of this, in the literature, there's also evidence that empathy alone is not really, it's kind of too all-encompassing a term, and that it also has some issues in that it's easier to feel empathy for people that are within your in-group rather than people from different backgrounds. And Paul Bloom, who I put a picture of here of his book, he's a psychologist, and he spent a lot of his career discussing the importance of empathy, has kind of circled back to actually the importance of compassion. So there's this kind of two sides to this story right now, where perhaps we should be not just thinking about increasing empathy, because it's quite challenging for people to engage in just empathy and perspective taking with people who they consider outside of their in-group. So we were kind of working with these two frames as we were considering our methodology. And I'll walk you really quickly through our methods. And again, if there are any questions about more details, feel free to ask us in the Q&A. So we had 2 field sites that we worked with. We ran this study, one in the lab in my lab at Occidental College, and then we also ran this at the Autry Museum of the American West. And across both of these sites, we had 175 participants who we engaged with. And all the participants viewed these photographs by Edward Curtis, which we can have a whole substantial discussion about as well. But I'll just stop here and say these are the particular photographs that we chose for a host of reasons. And in the lab, participants viewed more photographs than they viewed in the Autry, where we set up a small exhibit where they viewed only 4 of the photographs. I have 3 of them highlighted here in green. And across both field sites, we randomly assigned participants to one of 3 conditions. We call these control, suppression, or perspective taking. So in the control, we recruited folks, for example, in the museum, we brought folks in and we told them, hey, you're going to be participating in this evaluation where we ask you a host of questions about what you're viewing. But in the control case, we didn't actually give them any kind of prompt. In the perspective taking case, we asked them to actually take on the perspective of the person that they were looking at in the photograph. We had a very particular prompt that we used, but in general, that's what we said to them. And in the suppression case, there's evidence that if you tell people to kind of be objective and not think about the kinds of stereotypes that exist in the community already, that can tend to backfire. So we also had that as a condition that we wanted to compare perspective taking and control to. So we, 1, told people nothing, just asked them for their impressions. 2, some people we asked to take on the perspective of the individual that they were engaging with. And 3, asked them to be as objective as they could be in their assessments. So those are the 3 conditions that we had. And then depending on their field site, we asked them different things. So first, after viewing each image, whether or not they were in the lab or whether they were in the museum, we asked them to either write a brief passage about their impressions or reactions, or they verbally provided us with their impressions and reactions and what they saw in the photo. We also asked them to rate how emotionally moved they were from a range of 1 to 6, with 6 being the most moved. And then we also asked them a host of demographic questions about their age, their gender, if they had any experience with a Native community. And these were fairly open-ended questions. And then in the lab, we couldn't do this in the museum, unfortunately, because we didn't have the technology and setup to do this. But in the lab, we also had participants eye gaze recorded. We used an eye tracker to record that, so I'll walk you through those findings as well. So before we go on here, I just wanted to pause and ask you if you had any questions or clarifications that you wanted, or just any comments as we're talking.
And feel free to make this problem solving about your own museum or your own study, because we really want to tailor this to your group and what's going to be most productive for you.
I'm going to encourage people to speak up. In this mode, we're not able to see everybody's face, so raising your hand may not be the most effective way of getting our attention. But we're a small group, so if there's questions or comments, just jump in there.
I'll jump in, and I just want to say what I'm going to be paying attention to. Just really appreciating the fact that empathy, using one methodology to apply to several different cultural identities, several different types of identities. I appreciate that you're already flagging that. And so I'm interested to see how each time we learn these different types of methodologies, or like the approach, maybe even like leaning toward compassion, versus empathy. I'll be thinking about like how that applies, even within what we're looking at. We're gauging a community that is going to be coming to an exhibition that addresses Islam and cultures that go across geographies and identities. So there, even from one Muslim to the next, we can't all be lumped into one category. So as with American Indians. So
thank you for responding with that, because I think before we started the study, we tried to find out what other studies, of course, had been done in this area, and I was looking specifically at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, where I've curated and watched very closely and been a part of. And the studies that they have for the visitor surveys just reminded me of things that I learned at the beginning of my career 30 years ago. I mean, it was like multiple choice answers, and so. We don't have a lot to build on, so we really do have to do, comparisons across cultures.
Thank you.
So I'll go ahead then and walk you through the findings. And this will be pretty brief. And again, we're going to be a bit cursory in the brevity. So if you have more particular specific questions, feel free to bring those up as well. So starting with the eye gaze, what we did is, I'm just showing you an example, but what we did is we looked at every image that participants looked at. We cut them up by taking a look at what we call them regions of interest. So we found different regions within the image. We cut them up to see where participants were gazing more and less. And you can see that we were particularly interested in seeing whether participants, depending on the condition that they were assigned to, whether they gazed more at the face of the person, so things like their eyes, their mouth, relative to some of the other more decorative features of the image. So things like, in this case, the headdress, necklaces, etc. And what you'll notice is that in the perspective taking condition, viewers tended to gaze at the eyes more than in the other conditions where they gazed more at the objects, so the decorative features. And this was consistent with some of the verbal and written descriptions that we found as well. So the people in the perspective taking case talked more when they verbally or wrote about the image, they talked more about the person, the human, rather than about the objects that they described in the suppression and control case.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say eye contact as a theoretical premise, continues to be vexing to a lot of disciplines, and visual anthropology included. Does eye contact represent that you're a victim, you've been caught like a mugshot? Does eye contact indicate that you're making some emotional connections, right, with the photographer, with those photographed? And So, we still don't have a conclusive answer to that, but we would like the study to be a part of that literature going forward. What does eye contact mean? And then just to state the obvious, I mean, in the suppression, people are looking at things, and museums are thingdoms, right? We're not presenting real human beings to museum visitors. We're presenting objects. So in some ways, just the presentation of objects means that we're alighting this connection with a community, because a human being is not there, it's just their object. So we're actually objectifying more by the material culture study that is a museum largely. So that's very obvious, but it kind of was a take home for me.
Were there any images I missed from the first group of all of them in the midst of doing an activity? Or are they all full frontal face portraits of the face kind of printed out? Okay. So in a way, they're already directed to the eyes.
That they should be, yeah. And in
that's
fact,
what you want. Okay.
Yes, and most people will, in general, when they look at a portrait or at a person, they start with the eyes and the nose and the mouth, right? Those are the places that they go already. And so it's interesting that in this case, that you can see, of course, that like red means that they're hanging out in those zones more. And so in all cases, their participants are looking at the eyes, right? It's just that in the perspective taking case, you can sort of see that they're not really going anywhere else. They're sticking to the eyes. Whereas in other conditions, they're roaming around the image more and they're spending more time on the objects, or on what we're calling them, objects. Perhaps the whole thing, the entire photograph is the object, but we're calling these the other regions. So things like the decorative features that would be in the image that are not the eyes and the mouth.
Yeah, and just really briefly, Curtis, I think most of you, if you're familiar, know that Curtis is associated with stereotypes, with one-dimensional typecasting, with the vanishing native, all of those things. But for the needs of our study, his photography legacy was perfect because it was large scale, and it was consistent, and it was standardized, and it gave us variety within that standardization. So there are certain things we wanted. And so that was, again, kind of a cross-disciplinary, kind of a freeing thing, because I had written a very central article at the beginning of my career that said, please no one ever do another Curtis show. And here I curated my own Curtis show, for us to gather this data. So for Sasha, none of those preconceptions were at play. She was like, Curtis who? She didn't really mean anything. So it worked. It's just an inert, and I kind of like that we kick Curtis around saying, you're just an inert tool for us to do some research.
And so, as I mentioned, we also had verbal and written descriptions. And what we did with those is we analyzed those using qualitative approaches. So we generated a host of criteria. Here's a list of that criteria. We looked for emotion-related judgments that people made, empathy-based descriptions, visual descriptions, conventional narratives, which were probably our most important measure to see whether people continued to express biases. The extent to which they were curious and uncertain. I'll give you a teaser. Very few people were curious and uncertain at all. They just threw in their certainty, which had a host of biases, and the kinds of historical assessments that they made. So we evaluated all of these criteria. And then this is a big clump of the findings. And this is our last set of findings that we'll tell you about. Do you want to take these over, Nancy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think most of you know that when you're in a museum, your emotions are heightened. And that we tend to think that's a great thing, right? Especially for this perspective taking. But, we have to look at what emotions are heightened. And when we ask people to take perspective, basically they were in many ways melding character with the subject in the photograph. They were using I, they were going into play and fantasy acting about, I am a chief and I am a princess. I mean, so the perspective taking, we set them on that route, and they ran all the way to the logical end, which is that this is me, and they can own it, and they can actually talk out of their mouths. So, this stuff, you can tell it kind of makes me hot under the collar. I'm just like, wow, this is almost an impossible task. How depressing. the empathy increased for perspective taking in both. So I love that we had the museum and the lab findings that could support each other, because you can imagine when people listen to us do this, they'll say, well, you used old photographs. What do you think? You need to use new photographs. Or, you know, and we would love to do, just to be very clear, a restudy on this. We would like to take up these premises again, maybe even with moving images. We've got a host of ideas. We're interested in your reactions as well. So we would like to, you know, restudy this. Conventional narratives were present among all conditions, more so with the perspective taking condition. So this generalized technique is not really that useful. And our finding that I underlined in preparation for this talk is that, particularly for Native Americans, these interpretations are really resistant to change, maybe even more so than other racial minorities. And this has this extraordinary social consequence. So.
And I just wanted to add one thing, is we spent a lot of time puzzling over like how this work is inconsistent with prior literature. Like, why is it the case that this prior literature on perspective taking shows this host of benefits, and yet we showed that there were all of these, that biases were not really mitigated per se, right? That there was continued use of bias, and that these conventional narratives were present among all conditions. So in part of trying to make sense of that, we started thinking about, well, we think what's happening is that people are coming into the museum and they're without any sort of framework, right? And that particular lack of framework makes them just use the information that they already have and then continue to confirm it over and over and over again. And that the perspective taking makes them confirm it in some ways. So in a lot of ways, it seems like, yes, empathy, people might feel more empathy, but that empathy isn't actually leading to increased understanding. So even though they feel it, it isn't based in an actual knowledge, right? In like a historical knowledge. And it isn't based in any kind of truth, I suppose.
Yeah, let's show them an example. I think the next slide is an example.
Perfect.
Yeah, so this is one of the examples that we got, and you know, the the highlighted ones is we're coding. I love doing the verbal coding, by the way. I could do that all day long. I found it really engaging. But you know, he's very weathered. He seems to be connected with nature. He seems confused about why he's being photographed. I could see him as a dad who is stern but loving. The chief in Pocahontas is my immediate first thought when I saw the image. I could see him riding a horse and being in battle. And so like people like fully jumped in to this exoticizing, this fantasy narrative informed by, you know, film that's meant to be entertainment largely. And do we have another one? Yeah, this one, odd looking image. The hair looks butchered. It looks wig-like. She's disturbing. You know, she has a false pride. I mean, all of this just from this one image, right? There's the bling. It looks like classic Dutch baby, the girl with the pearl earring. So they're trying to make connections, right? But they're making connections in an emotional sense that is primarily negative from the subject position. It's an odd juxtaposition. The total effect is weird. And so you can imagine if this is someone who's from your community, if this is your relative, you know, and these many people in these photographs are known, and they, of course, they do have relatives that are living today. I mean, this line of interpretation is, of course, really insulting and diminishing of someone's personhood. We did get the occasional, like a visitor. There was a young Latina woman who, when she saw this, I remember her being in the gallery and pausing and saying, wow, she looks like one of my friends. And like, I'm really concerned for her, you know. So, I mean, we would get these like diamonds out there, a diamond for me about what I would want someone to respond with, which is care, right, and compassion. But that was a very unusual response. I don't know, do we have one more? I think we just gave two.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I think we also were hoping that there would be some level of uncertainty and question asking rather than simply telling us things that they already knew. But that didn't happen as much as what either. And so,
and there were labels. There were labels too. So So
Right.
I don't want to leave that out. So they could tell what time period, where it was, the name of the tribe. Yeah.
Right. And so we just have some kind of overarching questions about how might museums and other institutions that are committed to social equity and change apply these findings, particularly if you're interested in thinking about how empathy can be used in museums. There's like a really big set of folks that are interested in thinking about how empathy can be applied in a museum setting. And I think this work speaks to that to some extent. And also who benefits from this research? How does this research actually generalize overall? So those are our kind of overarching questions to you to think about. And coming back to our initial recommendation about how do we actually encourage people rather than confirming their biases, how do we encourage them to build their curiosity, to ask questions, to not feel so certain or not feel that there's certainty required of them in a way. So those are our discussion questions for you, and we'll pause here.
I have a question. First of all, thank you so much for presenting this and encouraging the engagement. The people that were brought into the study, how did you find them? Who are they representing?
So there's two.
Because that's a challenge too.
That's a great question.
I could do the museum, and you want to do the lab, Sasha?
Yeah, the participants that were in the lab were primarily students. So they're students at Occidental or community members who are around Occidental that are basically of student age. That was the primary population in the
or
lab.
At a privileged institute, like a privileged, university, college. Yeah.
That's right.
And then the Autry Museum, well, we neglected to say too that we had students in our classes who are helping us collect data using iPads. And so they were on the floor of the Autry Museum. We tried to vary the days and times that we were collecting data with those students to accommodate families, different people's schedules. It was kind of challenging to do that, but we gave it our best go. And so we were recruiting opportunistically off the floor. Now, I admit I was helping students as they did it because they were very nervous about asking strangers for things. And part of our job was to train them. And so I would go out and say, like, there's this really cool thing you could do. Might be exciting for you to talk about at dinner tonight, or you're like, your kids may enjoy this, so we just brought them off the floor. And another thing is in the Jewel Case Gallery, which is a changing gallery within Art of the West, which is, devoted to cowboys and Indians and others, right? So it's kind of a permanent exhibit that has a variety of objects in there. And they're ordered around landscape and religion and transportation and some other themes, right? And so our exhibit space kind of merged seamlessly in that. No one knew that this was a data collection site.
Thank you.
And that the recruitment was fairly passive. It wasn't like an active process where we sent out recruitment emails to like the community. Mostly we just recruited people off the floor. And what that meant for the two sets of demographics at Autry and Oxy is that we did have like a relatively wide range of ages, but it turns out that the demographics like that actually visit the Autry were to a high extent were fairly similar to the Oxy demographics outside of age. So the variability was mostly the age. And then also we had some issues because another thing that happened was that a lot of kids came to the Autry. There were a lot of school groups, and we weren't able to, we didn't have, approval to actually test, young kids.
Of course, yeah.
We didn't do that. But yeah, that was the recruitment process.
And they were rowdy. And this was another instance where Sasha and I were learning from each other's disciplines, because for Sasha, it was noise in the data. And for me as an anthropologist, I was like, this is a perfect field site, perfectly representative. The fire alarm's going off, a kid just fell and cried. Like, you know, it was a lot of chaos in there while we were doing this. But I think that is better for me. I think that's even more accurate findings.
Sasha, I wonder, could we stop sharing at this point?
Yeah.
The PowerPoint. This way we could have a little bit more interaction with each other visually. So
let me lay a question out, because one of the things that, if you read the study, you'll see that we kind of took on the visual thinking strategies. And I have my sisters here with you. I don't want to put you on the spot, Martha, but we've talked about this a lot because it's seen as being like a go-to, and we kind of took a direct aim at them. No one's written us back and argued with us or told us anything about it, but there is, of course, literature around how visual thinking strategies it doesn't necessarily work well when it's like racially infused art. And I think it was Carrie James Marshall that they themselves had published kind of like, how do we somehow change our prompts with visual thinking strategies to accommodate the variable of race? And for me, that disqualifies your research question right there if you have to change it for race. But I don't know if any of you use visual thinking strategies, if you're familiar with that.
I do. And I like using it in classrooms at a university level, primarily for critique process. And so the audience all knows each other, and it just begins with looking at the artwork silently and then asking a series of questions. The first one is, what's going on here? For somebody who's well-versed in speaking at and analyzing art, that's an easy one to apply to a number of different forms of art that you might come across. For younger audiences and people who aren't accustomed to speaking about or analyzing art for a period of time, visual thinking strategies recommends work that has a narrative aspect to it. So one that has some ambiguity and ideally a lot of detail, so that people can look at the image and speculate about what's going on in it. So it doesn't apply so much to the situation, but VTS, I know the organization is looking at ways to speak about, for facilitators to handle those kinds of situations where, for instance, I think it was one work of art, and I can't remember the context, but it was this, if somebody looked as if somebody might be being hung. And so the student identified the person as a bad person. So the way you would speak when somebody responds to a work of art and makes a statement like, this person is being lynched, was a bad person, the response would be something more like, you see this person here who appears to be as if they might be hanging from a tree, and you're speculating that this could be a bad person. So you use conditional language. It doesn't refute it, but that's where you come back to. And you can get into some very thorny spots. And I know that's something that they're working on with coming up with protocols. Mostly the works are very carefully chosen to avoid situations like that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Martha, for jumping in and doing that. And I have to give you tons of credit because you have this vast background of working with children in museum and education settings.
Yes.
I don't, and that's like a whole nother level of analysis.
It's definitely the wild card group. Yes.
Let's see, Gustavo, you have your hand up.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time today. I had two observations, or maybe one observation and a question, but we're basically in talks with our museum here on campus, and a lot of what they're doing is looking at media as a way of immersing themselves into the data, so photography or video, which leads to different perspectives. And one thing that, the content they were working with was photography. So it went from small scale to large body scale, which leads to different other thoughts or understanding. So you can study not only the eyes, but the body mechanics and the behaviors inside the gallery as a totality. So just time and flow. So I was wondering how you thought about other strategies that would take the understanding of this type of information, which is artistic, from the material into something that be quantified. So that was what was in the last session of this series. And then when it comes to critique, I'm not really sure about, you know, how we do with different languages or methodologies. So I was taught, I go through CalArts and the Whitney independent programs methodologies of, you know, sign, sentence, statement. And the longest crit I've been in, it was like 9 hours straight for one artwork. So when I hear about deconstructing a work, I actually don't really know what we're talking about, because there are different ways of doing it. And when you reduce that to a level of a child, they're pretty sophisticated, because I actually taught children. They're sometimes more sophisticated than adults because they see the information for what it is. So we're just basically reframing and leading them into maybe open-ended narratives that they could come to terms with. And I agree that you know, you're not going to show them something that's violent or extreme unless it has to do with a museum exhibition, like you know, on the Holocaust, or like you know, Air and Space Museum, an accident in space. Like there needs to be an understanding of mortality. But I guess my question would be, have there been extensive studies when it comes to the process of deconstructing works? Because I'm very wary about scientists doing that if they don't have the same 20 or 30 years of experience in the arts as they do with their own discipline. Because this is what I've contended with for years. And I'm very aware that that might be inflammatory, but unless there's a complete and utter collaboration between a gallerist or a museum team, the artist, and then also the scientist, then there could be messages that run across each other. And even when it comes to data collection and quantification and measurement, that's also an issue. So my question would be, what other strategies or ways have you looked into to really think about this idea of visual, I think it's visual thinking or understanding, to deconstruct this type of knowledge?
So I'm just going to jump in with the American Indian content, and Sasha, I'll let you maybe take on the medium question, you know, or the other ways. And then Martha, I'll let you come back to visual thinking strategies, just in effort of time. I'm being a control freak. So in terms of the material, I would argue that if you're dealing with American Indian material, and this was a study, I'm an American Indian scholar, I've taught at CalArts before, deeply immersed in studio programs. So this was a study for me that was problem solving, because I saw such disturbing interpretations on the floor of the Autry Museum, which was my place of employment. And I saw the negative impact on other Native staff members that were having a hard time just doing their job. So I again, public service announcement, like I really do feel like I just want to try to fix some things that are hurting people right now. But I would argue that American Indian subject matter is always about genocide. I mean, we have a genocide on our soil that we haven't even admitted, so we can't say there's an inert space to interpret even a beadwork bag. I mean, that beadwork bag was probably collected off a battlefield, you know, so we're always there, you know, with that hard source material. And then I'll just, Sasha, before I go to you, I really want to go into films more because we got so many film references in this study. And so I would love to partner with the Academy Museum and figure out how we can use their visitor base to try to find out some things. Because a moving image, I would argue, is very different than the still Curtis, of course, you know, and a whole different host of registers there. But Sasha, do you want to talk about the medium part?
Yeah, let me just see if I understand some parts of your question, and you can stop me if I'm saying some irrelevant things. But so my expertise is in the kind of psychology and understanding what people are doing and perceiving when they're looking at something, right? Part of some of the work that I do is within art perception, but it only started in American Indian Studies with Nancy. So that was really where our collaboration started to get deepened. And so when you say something like, how is it to, what are we doing in terms of like deconstruct, how people are deconstructing an image? What we are looking at is kind of the standard museum visitor who spends like 20 seconds to 1 minute at each photograph or piece that they're engaging with. And so it's this really like small time frame. It's not like, I wouldn't call it at all deconstructing. It's like a very quick perceptual experience, and what they get, what kind of impressions they make in that really small, relatively small time frame. I think it's really interesting to start to think about how we can expand that. Like, how do you get visitors to engage more? But even in our case, like all of our participants, we tried to get them to actually engage with the photographs for longer. And they were so uncomfortable with even spending a minute more in front of, because we actually timed them in front of the photograph, that we actually had to decrease the amount of time that they spent because they weren't interested in participating for longer. So am I understanding that correctly, that you're asking about like that length of time that they spent?
Yeah, well, length, and also just the idea of, you know, who is this type of person you're talking about? Because I've been in museums where a random person can just love a photograph for hours. They come back a few times a day. So do you keep track of that same person throughout the lifespan of the exhibition? Or is it just, you know, a variable?
Yeah.
Can we switch over after this to Martha and let her, because I think she's got the beat on the visual thinking strategy with like people actually wanting to know more out of the art. We're kind of just, I hope this doesn't sound repetitive, but I'm just taking reality and trying to describe it. You know, more than anything else, and the reality is very flawed. And your arguments, I think, are really helpful because it's true. We've got a lot of mitigating factors from the get-go about how to even get close to that artwork. But Martha, let me let you jump in if you're okay with that.
Sure. I'm not sure. What would you like for me to describe or tell you something about visual thinking strategies, perhaps?
Well, no. I think for me, you know, I was disciplined, born in the academy, disciplined in the academy and in the profession. So when I hear visual thinking, I go, okay, that's one of many types of strategies to deconstruct and understand work. So what do you build on, and how is it contemporary enough that it creates a contrast with all these other investigations or knowledge creation? Yeah,
it's predicated upon this idea that there are different levels of looking. You know, you've got beginners, you know, and on to more advanced people who can stay with the work for longer rather than getting uncomfortable and standing in front of one for a while. And so the way that you start off with that process is you choose those types of works that have some sort of narrative appeal and lots of detail, so somebody can stand in front of it for a while. And the questions that you ask are, what's going on here? Not what do you see? And because what's going on here already puts you into the interpretive mode of thinking about it. And then when you get a response, and it might be, you know, I think that woman is sad, then you respond with, what do you see that makes you say that? And so they might respond with, you know, her shoulders are slumped, or she's looking away, or whatever. And then at that point, the facilitator would say, so you're noticing the woman's posture, and it looks to you as if she might be sad, and you also notice that she's looking away. Did I get that right? Is that correct? And if they say yes, or they choose to elaborate, then you paraphrase what they've said again.
Yeah.
And then when you're done, you say, yes, what more can we find? So all you do is just validate their viewpoint, and then somebody else speaks up, and maybe they've got an entirely different idea. Go through the same thing, paraphrase what they say, make sure that you said it right, and then, yes, what more can we find? And then as the process goes on, you'll wind up saying things like, as you paraphrase, you'll introduce that with saying, so you're agreeing with the earlier observation that she looked sad, and you're adding that. So you're keeping track of threads of the discussion as you go along, and you model how different perspectives build upon one another. And the conversation just keeps going until it winds up. And then you just say, wow, that was a really great discussion. I really appreciate everybody's contributions. And then
No,
you move on to another work.
So
And there
it's groupthink. It's groupthink, right? It's group narrative creation, right? Because that's what I'm hearing.
It is in that, but everybody is sometimes, you know, observation will take you off onto an entirely different perspective. And so you'll follow that for a while. So it might be, you know, you might wind up with 3 different stories that you follow to the end, and maybe they converge, maybe they don't. But the object is that we just had a really good discussion.
I don't want to monopolize any of the time. I'm very, very thankful for all that you've presented today. I would love to know more, Martha. Maybe we can talk about, you know, this type of research. And you know, I'm sorry, JD. It's such a great session today. I'm going to report back to my director, Dr. Joanne Couture-Marin. Would love to participate in the future if you can put her on our mailing list. But I think there's a lot of discussion here, and we're dealing with this here at the university, trying to work with museums and understanding how to measure and how to really come to terms with how we value people, because I think that's really what's important.
Just because you have some people that know who you are and some people who don't, can you introduce yourself? And I think we should let everybody have a moment to introduce themselves, but where you're coming from and your background. Yeah.
Oh, sure. My name is Dr. Rincon, Dr. Gustavo Rincon from the Media Arts and Technology program here at UCSB. I'm a postdoctoral scholar, research scholar right now for the Alisphere Research Group. I'll put a link in the chat. I function as an associate director for a lot of these curatorial exhibitions or the creation of immersive exhibitions inside and outside of the institution. Currently, we're working with Newton Harrison on the Sensorium project for Pacific Standard Time, and we're in talks with doing a project, hopefully if it goes through, at CalArts for next year. And they're all immersive. They're all about measuring, understanding, and talking about the idea of the world and how it's dying. So a lot of, we're trying to figure out how to make it accessible for children, parents, and scientists as well. So that's where I'm coming from. And I would love to continue the dialogue, and my director extends a warm welcome, and she would be here if she didn't double book today. But anyway, thank you.
Please do share that contact information. I'd be glad to reach out to. Are there other questions, or can we maybe? Oh, Jennifer has her hand up. Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for this study. I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I apologize that I haven't done so already, but I'm really curious about the context in which the participants viewed these images, particularly the context of the Autry. You mentioned that there was a small exhibition that visitors looked at, and then with the Occidental College participants, they looked at these photos in a lab. And I'm wondering if you noticed any sort of differences between the two groups? Because of course, those are wildly different contexts. And I'm curious as to whether one was more maybe empathic than the other in terms of the responses that you received.
Do you want to show a chart, Sasha? We do have a chart that we withheld because it was.
I can also just tell you that.
And
like,
hi, Jennifer.
differences. They were, a lot of the differences were kind of quantitative in the sense that, yes, we did see some differences, but not like a huge, not these like massive shifts in the quality of the experience. We did see that. And in the lab, people looked at them on a computer. So I think people are, especially now, this was pre-pandemic, but especially now a lot more used to looking at art in a digital kind of sphere and looking at photographs on a computer. So it wasn't like a completely new medium for them to be looking at these photographs. But the main differences that we saw between the lab and the museum were that people in the lab were less emotionally engaged, right? They like felt less connected. Yes, they had less empathetic kind of based responses. But it was like a small quantitative shift, like less, but not completely different, not like the opposite.
I think Sasha froze.
Nancy, maybe you can context of the outro.
Yeah, my audio is coming and going. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Nancy, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Maybe Sasha's
Sasha.
freezing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The exciting thing was that, you know, the data converged, and that was kind of like our moment, you know, that perspective taking had limited effect. You know, that biases were persistent throughout. And so if you read the study, and I'm happy to follow up just one-on-one with you on it too, you know, that was kind of the surprising and kind of reassuring in terms of our findings, that the data in both sets seem to mirror each other. And part of that could be what Sasha explained, that the demographic was similar in terms of like race and you know, income. Age was different. You know, the Autry has an older audience set, of course. But really good question. Yeah. Does anyone else want to introduce themselves? Because there's some folks on the call that I don't know that well. Lucas or Benjamin or LaDan, we've talked. Julia.
And Julia, and even Hannah, who's back in the background over there. We don't want to forget her.
Hi, Hannah.
To say hi. So.
Hi, Nancy. I'm Ben Dubansky. I'm a developmental biologist. I'm at LSU, and I work in academia quite a bit. And my research as a developmental biologist is surrounds understanding how organisms in early development are able to deal with environments or not deal with them. So some of the research where my research is done is in areas where there is a lack of cultural competency in the South. And I was actually just on a call about a buyout program for one of these areas where that is just not habitable anymore. So they're like buying the people out, and there's art that goes down in these areas. And I wonder, you know, like you had mentioned, looking at these things through a realistic lens, and maybe even forestalling conclusions, like I think you brought that up. I think that what you guys are talking about can be applied to the science as well. And I'm very interested in how we can judge the efficacy of our work in these areas by using these kind of techniques. I think it is translatable. So that's why I'm here, trying to figure that out, how to apply it in my realm.
Yeah, thank you.
I always love the fact that Ben shows up in these places where you don't expect a scientist and just very interested in these questions. And it, you know, you talk about having like stereotypes or preconceived ideals of how other people think, And the fact that we're finding commonality in this conversation is really wonderful. And I appreciate Ben's participation in all these conversations. Julia, would you introduce yourself? Tell us where you're coming from.
Sure. Hi, I am so glad to participate. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I'm in Central Illinois at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I work at the Institute for Genomic Biology, and I have a really incredible, amazing job where I get to work with scientists who use our imaging department to make huge images of their work, and then I get to work to transform those images into art pieces and represent those to the public in lots of different places. And I get to help our outreach team make all kinds of different games and spaces and events and exciting things that help to relate to the science that is done at our institute back to the public in various ways. So I keep coming to these, and I feel like we are definitely young in our engagement with how to do self-analytical processes on how people are engaging with the work. But this is all very informative, and sort of considering the differences between empathy and compassion is something I'm interested in to walk down that route. And also I'm really curious about this space where you're talking about people's bringing their sense of certainty to a conversation around what something means, rather than this sort of sense of curiosity or unknowing. And that's really triggered a bunch of really interesting ideas for me about how to try to bring that topic to how we're asking questions of some of our people that we're working with. So thank you so much. This was really cool.
Thanks, Julia. And Lucas, I think you're the only person we really haven't said hi to.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Perez. I'm the manager of art and empathy projects and innovation at the San Diego Museum of Art. So as you could tell by my title, our museum has invested heavily in the idea of empathy and that art can promote empathy among people. We're working right now with UCSD's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. They've been running a 2 or 3 year long study with our art collection using eye trackers and EEGs. And I'm not a scientist, so if I mess anything up, let me know. So one thing that I've noticed between your demonstration or your presentation today and what UCSD is doing is involving the eye trackers. And it seems to me a lot of the findings look very similar, that's focused on the eyes and the faces, if there are faces, if it's portraiture, that type of thing. So I'm wondering, what sort of methodologies are being taken to interpret that data? Because I think as an artist as well, we've known for hundreds of years that people will automatically look at faces and eyes. So for example, if you're talking about the perspective taking prompt, what sort of interpretations are you making between that eye scan and that prompt? I guess it's something I'm curious about.
Yeah. So I think this is what this comes back to something that Nancy mentioned about eye contact, because that's what's really tricky, is what does eye contact even mean? Like what are the interpretations that one can make? So the way that we have like particular quantitative techniques for trying to understand the eye tracking data, but what that involves typically in eye tracking data is just breaking up the image into chunks and then deciding which chunks mean what. And so what we did, we just break it up into chunks of like the eyes, the face, the stuff around it, and see whether or not, so we made the interpretation that maybe is not the right interpretation depending on the population that you're looking at, right? So it might be that eye contact means something very different. And actually not might be, we know that eye contact means different things for different groups of people, right? So some people may think that looking into the eyes of someone is a disrespectful thing to do. And so it isn't a sign of like them sharing humanity, but it's a sign of disrespect. We think the interpretation that we made in terms of like our relatively limited demographic is that looking into the eyes and face of the person does something with respect to like seeing their humanity or seeing like into their soul, like the window into the soul metaphor. But again, like that, like I said, that might not be accurate for particular populations. And the other thing to note about all of this, like scientifically, is this is all like based on averages. So when you say like, yes, we know for a long time in terms of eye tracking that people look into the eyes of the person, what we're doing is comparative. So it's not like we're seeing whether or not people look into the eyes. We're trying to compare across conditions, whether in one condition, in one case, one of the prompts that we give, do people look into the eyes and the face more relative to these other parts of the image than they would in the other condition. And this kind of comes back to Gustavo's point before, is like, how long do they even spend with these images to like be able to make these kinds of assessments? So the work that you're talking about with like, we've known for a long time that people look into the eyes and face of the person, or eyes and nose of the person, that's like very immediate. Within 2 seconds of viewing an image, people are doing that. What happens after that 2 seconds there's like huge amounts of variability in the psychological literature of where people tend to go. And where that variability comes from is typically based on their task or like the prompt. And so we had people spend more time with the images, but it was a very short amount of time, right? This is like matter of seconds when you do this kind of thing in the lab. So it isn't, I think it really speaks to this point of like, are we really able to interpret what people are doing in the museum? Are they really spending this short amount of time? And I think my partial answer to this is like, these technologies can be useful for some to like think about the average person. So I think in my experience, the average person doesn't spend like 20, 30 minutes in front of a work. That would be amazing. I think there are ways in which there are methods that promote that more. I've seen it for sure. Like I've been to exhibits where people are actually just like clumps of people are sitting in front of a work. But it's unusual in my experience. So I think where kind of this work is touching on that person that spends a relatively short amount of time and trying to understand what's in the head of that person and where they look, rather than even like, I don't think this work even really speaks to like trying to engage them for longer spans of time. Rather, how do we engage them in a way that potentially like encourages them to see humanity more, right? Maybe one of these prompts helps them see that more. Does that answer part of your question, I hope?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and I dropped into the chat this study that's 30 years old, but I still teach with, and it's Lutz and Collins reading National Geographic. And their findings with eye contact, it's largely that if you are making eye contact with the viewer through a photograph, and they're looking at just the covers primarily of National Geographic magazines over a period of decades. If you are looking at the viewer, so there are all these, they have 7 ways of viewing. I love the 7 ways of engaging. They're very different things that happen. Just when you think there's a 2-way street, there's 7 ways. But on top of that, they demonstrate through their study that you are more subservient if you're making eye contact with the camera, right? And so that you're more likely to be of color, you're more likely to be a woman, you're more likely to be poor, you're more likely to be old or young. You know, they cull the data that way. So again, for me, it's fascinating that we can figure out that people are either making eye contact or not. But what that eye contact means, we don't know. I mean, I'm following my own recommendations. I do not know what that eye contact means. And I think it's probably going to vary by context and time. And then the other thing I'll just say lastly, because I know we're going to be running out of time, is that, you know, I have the luxury from being a researcher and occasionally a friend and worker inside a museum, that I'm okay if the museum is failing at their task, you know? I'm okay with that. I just want to know that that's the case, right? And I think often when we're inside a museum, or if we have this adoration, I got in a thing recently with the Fowler, where I was just like, I used the phrase worshiping at the altar of the Fowler Museum. That tells you where my orientation was there. It'll follow me the rest of my career saying that. But you know, if you adore a museum too much, then you're not going to change, right? You're too invested in them being successful. And so for me, the eye-opening, freeing thing here was like, I'm just figuring out what's happening in the museum. The museum can fail at this task, and we need to say the museum failed at a task. And then we need to collect data and do something different next time. But if we keep doing the same thing and we keep failing, then why are we even coming into work in the morning, right? And so I think that distancing is somewhat helpful. For me, it's been liberatory.
We were just commenting that we don't like the museum to fail in this sense, especially being in a museum context. But I think I like the idea of a museum at least qualifying what it's doing, you know, and being as transparent as possible in its efforts, you know, and its attempts to engage wider communities. I think, you know, when all of this, you know, and in fact, like doing these workshops in general, a lot of it generated out of this interest, you know, in talking with JD about how can we find a way to instill an evaluation process that will help us respond to the audience that we're trying to attract. So so in going down, and I didn't have that experience, you know, and I'm also not you know, and I'm not an interpretation officer. I'm a curator, but I have an interest in the wider picture. And so I think part of that was also like first, like identifying who do we want to reach out to the most, because we can't possibly connect to everybody. So that's why I asked questions about also who are the participants in the study, and then how we go about trying to bring like a small sample group to help us look at messages that we want to put out there. But then also looking at how the museum space can encourage engagement, which even includes just having a moment of rest, because you're walking through and you need to just rest, you know, and are we taking that into consideration as well, the overall visitor experience, which then the answers to those might help with future, you know, ways that we approach how we show displays, how we create a rhythm of the visitor experience going through from gallery to gallery, or from actual exhibit, or, you know, object to object or display. So I think and also, you know, at every level, what we're trying to do, you know, we'd like to be sourcing work from craftspeople whose livelihoods will benefit from their works being sold in a shop, rather than having some cheap mass-made object that then makes money, and they are the ones who are actually generating the inspiration for that, and they don't get any credit. It makes me think maybe we should on the website or somewhere also share this with our audience and say, here are the things we're trying to do, not so that we pay lip service to, you know, the diversity, inclusion, like the IDEA or DEI, but to just say, we're part of an institution that's an evolving institution. Museums should be seen, if you know, I think, as, or should be, evolving institutions. We need to change to fast changing times. We need to change to fast changing also views and constant rethinking. I would even redo certain things that I've done in the past, you know, because, and I have to, and that's good. And that's a good failure, I think, you know, when you talk about how, I think we're kind of, it's a similar outlook, if I'm not mistaken, embracing those failures and maybe sharing that as we're trying to do projects like that. But also that's the best place maybe also to help qualify these studies that we do, to say, we constantly realize, it's like, you know, the more you know, the more you realize, the less you know. And I really appreciate these approaches that you're taking, because that really does help us think about what we'd like to do for this exhibition.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. As you're talking, I'm thinking about Sasha. Sasha, I don't know if I can put you on the spot for this, but what you're doing with the census and museum exhibits is a whole nother line of research.
Oh my God, Sasha,
sociology.
No, I not senses like that. Senses like multi-sensory, like the
Yeah, that's
trying to kind of understand, yes, that senses, trying to understand kind of broadly how multiple senses contribute to our experiences. Some of the work that I think Nancy's thinking about too is older stuff that I did to that I can talk about, but maybe is maybe too much
As a curator, I'll just put it out there. As a curator, the work that she did.
And yeah, but something that I'm interested in I guess I'll briefly mention this work that I did, but it was trying to show visitors that their multiple senses are being engaged when they're in the museum space. So not just that their visual senses are being engaged, but the way in which auditory information, tactile, haptic information contributes to their experience, and how those different sensory experiences might have systematic effects on the way in which they interpret. And so I wasn't like testing those things. So a lot of my work is in that domain, is in the kind of more basic research domain. It's not within art. It's trying to just understand how our senses come together. So how does our auditory, how does what we hear and what we see and what we touch combine in the brain to yield these really seamless experiences? And yeah.
Well, I find that super fascinating, because the other thing too is that this project has got me thinking much more in general about even just the way that we present Islamic visual culture, and really just using texts like Islamic texts to help guide us, and when you're talking like this, it's like, I'd love to see what your take is on these theories of optics, that Islamic scholars have, because we're going to try to bring those out and have that bring out this idea of and looking at the literature of the culture that it's in, as a window into understanding. And so that it's not just for understanding, so-called Islamic visual culture, which I realize is also a problematic term, sort of the least common denominator, but, why can't we use that same theory to look at something else, or the text that's inspiring our exhibition? It's the way that it's like an encyclopedia of the world and beyond, ultimately going back to God and Islam, but seeing like these images as a way to then trigger you to have a visceral reaction to it by viewing these wonders of creation or these technologies, and to try to bring that out and using literature and frameworks that come from the very same culture. And I just feel like that would be such a fascinating collaboration with the kind of work that you're doing that does bring these senses together, because there's been writing on this too.
Yeah. And I really resonate with you saying something that you said earlier as well about telling the visitor what you're doing. And that was part of my experience with this sensory exhibit that I had prior, is that telling the visitor simply that like there are multiple senses that contribute to their experience, and for that, not for me to tell them how they contribute, but for me to tell them to like actually observe on their own that this happens, and to think about the ways in which it does, helped engagement quite a bit, and helped them to like get a better, not just like
you shared your vulnerability. You shared your vulnerability from the start.
And in that space too, we had, again, I wouldn't call it like an evaluation. I did ask for, so I had like a little worksheet that people could walk around the exhibit with, and they could turn it in at the end if they wanted to, which was great for me because it was like data for me. But for them, the goal, it asked them a whole host of questions about what their experiences were. So it asked them things like, I had sound in the exhibit, I had, temperature shifts, and I asked them things like, how does what you're hearing right now help in your interpretation with what you're seeing right now? what is your current mood? How has that shifted? So I asked them questions that I thought were like, rather than asking them something about their knowledge, it was more about their current experiences, the relationship between what they're learning about and their experiences. And it led to this like huge amount of engagement. Like people were in the space for much longer just because they were being told almost what they were given, some kind of context about what we were trying to do too. And so I think I really resonated with that point that you were making of like, can we tell visitors more about what it is that the goals are, what it is that they're doing. And circling all the way back to visual thinking strategies, I think this idea, sometimes the idea of visual thinking strategies can like, I think be problematic because there is like this kind of lack of context. And so if there's more of this kind of context given to the visitor, it kind of like in my eyes encourages more buy-in and more desire to learn, more desire to be curious, and less of this desire to like know everything and be right. And so I think sometimes like it's that mix that we're trying to touch on.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm vacillating with what the audience is capable of, Sasha, because I think like on the one hand, you know, when we've talked about, of course, the sense is that maybe we're entering an era where the museum visitor gets to dial up and order their experience like you would, you know, a fast food hamburger or something. Like I want a romantic experience. This is a date. I'm in the museum. I want this smell. I want this music. I want this outcome, you know, from you. Like and I get this like from working with students so much who are becoming more and more demanding. Sorry, they seem that way to me. And then with maybe there's a visitor that is entirely equipped and wants to engage and actually do some work in the museum, you know, and so I think I vacillate between those two poles of what we're dealing with here. You know, is it someone who's going to order me around, or is it someone who really is capable of being a partner in learning? I don't know.
I just want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to tell Jenna, it reminds me of when we first started the Autry, they wanted us to put on lab coats and make it look like a lab. Do you remember that? I think it was Josh wanted us to like really make it into this laboratory, like we were performing, doing research, and we were going to invite the visitors in to do a study with us, and that we would have these false lab coats and maybe this gadgets behind us. And we completely rejected that whole thing. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That was Go on, LaDonna, I interrupted you.
No, I just wanted to share, she's being very modest back there, but she has made some interesting observations throughout. And one of them, I hope you don't mind my sharing, just about the fact that when you also ask somebody to look for a long time, that, you know, even when she mentioned an exercise in, we both went to the same graduate school, and there's a professor that gives an exercise to students to look at an image for 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, 20 minutes straight.
And then immediately that puts you feel this expectation, so that from the feedback that you were getting and people's observations or their reactions, like, you know, Sasha, you mentioned also the feeling they need to know. Sometimes it's like they might be just telling you what they think you want to hear, or what they think they're supposed to know, rather than freeing themselves to just maybe have a more visceral reaction, you know, and maybe, you know, does giving away a little bit of your own vulnerability open the door for them to open theirs. So sometimes you don't want to give the information. I'm certainly not an anthropologist or a scientist to know all of these factors then, you know, of course, then affect other things. But I know I ended up not going the anthropology route because I just felt I was always going to be there and change the data just by my presence. So I think in some ways, figuring out how one can share this, or in any case, qualifying things all the time. How does one do that on a public level, on a public audience level? That'll be something that maybe we really take into account as we try to do our project. And these conversations, it's like adding layers, and they're very, very helpful. So I really appreciate you sharing these with us.
Yeah, as you mentioned that, I started thinking about who has the power. And in a classroom setting, there is a very unequal power distribution, right? Students have to do what I tell them to do, right? Whether they want it or not. I have a real problem with that, but that's like how it's working. And in museums, I don't know. I get the feeling that the visitors want to tell us what they want to have happen in that setting, right? And so how could you create a more equitable power balance in the museum context would be another question.
I just wanted to, I guess, interject for a second, but I'm still quite, I would love to maybe think through what it would be like to make a contemporary museum right now, because when I hear everyone talking, we have different bodies of knowledge, and I'm not sure if we're talking about even the same things. I think we have the right motivations for equity and accessibility. And that's why, I mean, I asked the question, JD, who is actually putting all this together? Is there like a foundation for standards of equity and inclusion and, really thinking through all of this work? Because my background is in architecture and in engineering, so there's standards in both. And then you can refer to them and there won't be this ambiguity where if the donor, I think here at UCSB, Charles Munger wants to give us 1.5 billion for basically 5,000 person dormitory with no windows. And he thinks he's an architect because he has money. I think when I hear about museums and I hear about schools, that's what I hear. The donor always supersedes the intellectual or the professional. And I think our calling is much higher. We want to fight for the children and the future. And so anyway, instead of preaching, I just wanted to say, this is so great. I just want to know more and how to help.
Well, I think that call to action is kind of a nice way to end this, because it doesn't really end it. It actually just has us looking forward to the next time. I'm going to put this in the chat, and I've put this a couple of times. There is a Google Drive that Ryan, who regrets that he can't be here with us today because of some other obligations, created this Google Drive for us to, if we have documents, if we have evaluation tools that your museum has given you permission to share, please drop those into those spaces. There's also a Slack channel that Ryan has set up for us that is a place for us to continue to network. I think regarding next salons and our contents, I love Nancy and Sasha, thank you so much for doing this. If there is anybody here who would either like to present or know somebody that we should present, ask to come in to present as a way of starting conversations. I think this is beneficial. I do think that most of us are kind of fizzling out for the summer, so let's kind of stay in contact either through Slack or email me, share with me your suggestions, and let's take some of the challenges and ideas home with us and percolate. Nancy, Sasha, thank you again, and Martha, thank you for making a guest appearance where it was an extra treat to have you with us. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity to share the research, guys. Have a safe summer.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Sasha.
Have a great summer,
Bye.
you guys. Thank you.
You.
Thank you so much. Have a great summer.